Thank you so much for coming to these inaugural lectures and resource day. That is a made-up title. I was going to say the first annual, but you know, I think I'm invested in not having another inauguration a year from now. That would mean it was somebody else. But we do hope to continue some form of resource days, of being your partner as we think about ministry in this changed and changing world, and so I'm delighted that you could be here. My name is David Lose. I am pleased and proud to work at this fine institution and to welcome you to what I hope is the beginning of a number of occasions where we can be together and share resources and wisdom and ideas as we think together about how to be church in this new world. When we were talking about the inauguration, a couple people planning it said, so, you know, sometimes a lot of people will do something special, do something, what do you want to do? And I said, that's really easy. I want to have two of my best friends come to town and do what they do so well, which is enliven us with their faith and their insight and inspire us to think about being church today. And so the first colleague I want to introduce, and I'm so delighted that she accepted the invitation to be here, is Dr. Audrey West, who served from 2000 to 2008 as Associate Professor of New Testament at LSTC. She has taught in several different Doctor of Ministry programs, including for several years where she was gracious enough to teach with me, and we always had such a good time together. A lot of other things I could tell you about her. Some of that is on the back of your schedule, but you should also know that she is a swim coach and learned probably as much about teaching and being in the world and leadership from that kind of role, and hopefully that will inform a little bit about what she says. And she is an aunt, and I know that will inform some of what she says as well. So without further ado, I'd ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Audrey West.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really a delight to be here this morning and to see so many folks out here. I have a couple of other introductory things that I want to share before I get started. The first one is to let you know that I am something of a theological mutt. I was baptized and confirmed in the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, my family's church out in California. I've been Lutheran, ELCA Lutheran, for more than half of my life, having joined the Lutheran Church while I was living in Kansas City. I'm married to a Moravian clergy person. So I believe that makes me a Presby-Lutheravian. And all of those different pieces, no doubt, inform my lenses, the ways that I experience God, the way that I talk about my faith, the way that I read the scriptures. And probably you will be able to discern those lenses even more clearly than I can. Because sometimes when we're living behind them, we don't recognize that they're there. So I just want to let you know that those are some of the lenses through which I read. Also, David mentioned that I used to be a swim coach, and that has been very influential in my work as a teacher. But there are a couple aspects of that job that I think I need to point out, mostly just to warn you. I spent a lot of time on the pool deck. Kick your feet. Put your head down, swim hard into the finish. I said, kick. It's really hard for me to stand still. And so I might move around a little bit during our conversation this morning. Please, if you're playing solitaire or checking your email or whatever, just keep doing that, okay? I don't really mind. I move around because of the swim coach in my legs. It just hasn't left me yet. And I always feel like I need to give that disclaimer to folks. It makes it really hard for the videographer. And so I apologize to anybody who's watching this through a recorded program, but that's kind of how it goes. The other thing that I think is important about, two other things that are important about coaching. or at least are important to me about my experience as a swim coach. One of the jobs of a coach is to remind her players or her team, or his team, whatever, of all the stuff they already know, right? It's time for the game. You've been practicing. You've worked hard. You've done drills. There's all kinds of stuff that goes into the game or the match or the meet or whatever. And one of the jobs of a coach is to help people get warmed up for that, to remind them what they know and to warm them up for the competition that's coming. So I see my job this morning as something like that. I'm the warm-up act, or the warm-up conversation generator, so that for the rest of our day together, we can be ready to share our insights, to reflect together, to learn together, to bring what we have to the table, bring what we already know to the game. And so I just want to, that's another thing I kind of want to let you know that I'll be heading for this morning. The coach's job is to encourage the team when they're down by lots of points and there's not much time left. You're down by points and there's not much time. I think that's the word that we've been hearing about the state of the church today. We're down by lots of points and there's not much time. The real big concern for all of us who care deeply about the faith and care about the church and care about living our lives committed to the Christ that we know through the Holy Scriptures, one of the challenges in this everyone's telling us that it's just not working anymore. And many of us are seeing that every day. Those of you who are serving in various kinds of ministries, whatever shape those ministries take, whether you are ordained or rostered or certified by your denomination, whether you're serving as a lay person, whether you are committed in your work that's not specifically church related, but you're living in faithful, living your faith out in the world, in all of those kinds of settings, we're really being greatly challenged. The culture is changing all around us. The church no longer holds the same power or authority that it used to hold. Our numbers are down for many of us. We have whole generations of folks out there who call themselves nuns, N-O-N-E. Nuns. What's your faith tradition? None. Or spiritual, but not religious, right? We've all seen this in our own settings, and we've read about it in various kinds of essays and articles all over the place. We have a lot of anxiety and conflict about that. Anxiety about where we're headed as a church, and conflict over what's the right way to go. How are we going to get out of this mess? Is there anything we can do about it? We see ourselves in a very, very difficult situation. We're down by points and not much time to go. And the question comes up, will our children have faith? Or as someone else has said, and I don't know where this came from, so if someone knows the source of this quote, will our faith have children? Where's that from? Will our faith have children? That's a question that deeply concerns many of us, perhaps most of us. And so what I want to talk about this morning is the role of story as faith formation. Story as faith formation. By the way, before I get started in that, has it occurred to you that the situation that we're facing in the church today, cultural pressure, low numbers, I didn't even mention the not much money for many of us, right? Limited resources. Has it occurred to you that that's pretty much what the early church was facing, right? We've been here before. We've practiced this before. We've seen it in our experience before, if not in our very own lifetimes, certainly in the experience of the testimony of our scriptures, the story of the church, the testimony of the church. We've been in this place before. So we're going to talk about that a little bit this morning as well. About a year ago, I had washing machine pieces all over the floor of my house. YouTube is amazing. My front-load washing machine had died, and I wasn't willing to send it to the landfill yet. It wasn't old enough, I didn't think, to be put out to pasture. And so I watched some YouTube videos and took the washing machine apart and left it all over the floor of our house. Why? Well, as I told you, the machine was broken. But also because when I was a kid, we had a Volkswagen engine in the floor of our living room. Now, not the whole time. It didn't sit there all the time. But for quite a long time, when I was a child, we did. We had a VW engine in the middle of our living room. My parents had this wonderful Volkswagen bus. It was one of the things with the sunroof and the little star. I think they called them star windows, so that you could ride around in the back and look out and see the stars overhead. And we used to drive every year from our home in California to various places around the country. We would travel to Ohio, or we would drive up north to Canada, or we'd head out to Utah to visit my grandparents. That bus took us everywhere. And as kids, we loved it. It was just fabulous to sit in the back, and even if we're driving in the middle of the night, we had those little windows, so we could look out, and it was really cool. The problem, have any of you ever had a Volkswagen bus, like back in the 60s or 70s? The problem with Volkswagen buses, they have this remarkable tendency to break down in really inconvenient places, like especially if it's hot, because they had an air-cooled engine, and if the air outside was too warm, then the engine would get overheated, and then bad things would happen. So our VW bus used to break down all the time in the middle of Nevada. We'd get about 1 day's drive away from home, and the whole thing would just do whatever it did. I don't even really remember. But we spent a lot of time in mechanics' waiting rooms, hoping that the thing would get repaired. So one time my mother decided, you know what, I'm just getting really tired of sitting with 4 children out in the waiting room of the mechanic's office. I'm going to solve this problem. And so she bought a book. I have to look this up because I can never remember the title. How to Keep Your Volkswagen Alive. A manual of step-by-step procedures for the complete idiot. It was the 1960s print version of YouTube. And so for quite a long time, we had papers and diagrams and drawings all over the living room floor, along with the Volkswagen engine, which my mother had convinced my dad to take out of the car and bring into the house so that she could match up the engine with the diagrams in the book. So she did that. We had parts all over the floor. And I'll tell you, our house was the most popular place for all the kids to come. They just loved the fact that we had this engine sitting right in the middle of the room. So she learned how the engine worked. Everything's great. She gets it all taken apart. She gets my dad to help her put it back in the car, connect all the pieces and everything. Fabulous. So next time we head out for a trip, and we're on our way east somewhere, and right around somewhere in rural Missouri, the car breaks down. And we kind of limp and putt our way to the nearest exit. Of course, back in these days, we drove on the back highways all the time, not on the interstate. So we go to the next place we can pull off, and we coast our way down the hill into the one service station in this town. Get into the bay, the mechanic looks at the car, and he says, well, your engine is toast. You're going to need a new one. And I don't have one, but I'll find you one. So he did whatever magic mechanics do, and he found a rebuilt Volkswagen engine somewhere in the middle of rural Missouri, and he had it delivered the next day to his little shop. And then he came out and he said to my father, I've never worked on a Volkswagen before, and I don't really know how to take the engine out and put the new one in. And my father said, well, I don't really know either, but I know someone who does. And so my mom walks into the mechanic's bay, stands next to the guy, and tells him how to take the old engine out and how to put the new engine in. Why did she do that? Because we had a Volkswagen engine in the middle of our living room floor. Now, I tell you that story for a couple of reasons. One, because it just totally delights me that my mother would take apart a Volkswagen engine and leave the pieces all over the middle of the living room floor. There's something totally cool about that, and a little weird, but it's cool. And so I take great delight in that. But I also share that story because I want to use it to help illustrate some of the things that story, that narrative, that telling the stories of our lives can do for us. Stories reveal something about their characters and about the people who tell them. Stories are revelatory. They reveal about the person who tells them and about their characters. I'll bet you have discerned quite a few things about my mom, and probably about my family too, just from hearing that story about Volkswagen engine parts in the middle of our living room floor. I'm just guessing. But I want to test my hypothesis. What do you know about my mom? And you can just call this out. This isn't a test. Well, it is a test. I'm testing my hypothesis. But I'm not testing your answer. I'm not looking for a particular answer. What do you know about my mom? She's what? Curious. Yeah, that would be true. Confident. Sometimes. Adaptable. Yeah.
She's not a neat freak.
Not a neat freak. That would be true. She's logical. Yep, she did go on to study electronics and mathematics. Not afraid to try something new. Frugal. That's true too. Not bound by roles. That's right. She was a 50s or 60s stay-at-home mom, but she wasn't constrained. There were many ways she was not constrained by that. Anything else?
She's not afraid to keep something old.
Not afraid to keep something old. That's true too. Considerate. Can you say a little bit more?
Of the mechanic's feelings of her not just taking the tools herself.
Considerate of the mechanics. Yeah, I never thought about that. She didn't just take his tools and say, I'll just do it. No, she coached him. She taught him. She respected his shop and allowed him to do the job. And I'll bet he learned something from that experience.
Did she have to pay him?
I'll have to ask. I don't know. The question, did she have to pay him? Probably. Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't know. What would you guess about my mother? Would you guess that she was probably more quiet and shy or more assertive? You would guess that she was assertive. Now, there's a place that particular story doesn't tell you everything about my mom. Because my mom is generally an introverted, quiet person who some people might describe her as shy. If she were here today, and I've asked her permission about sharing this story, if she were here today, she probably would be sitting in the back, and she would be delighted to be here, but she might be hoping that no one would ask her to talk to her neighbor, which some of you, I'm sure, are hoping, right? So that story reveals some things about my mother, but it doesn't reveal everything about her. There's still more that we might learn, and if I had time, I could tell you more stories. One more that I will tell you, because it builds off of this one. Because all of those things that you have raised up are true about my mom, except for the one about being assertive. Not being typically assertive, I should say. All those things are true. When my father became ill some years ago and had to enter into hospice care, the question came, was he going to be moved into a care facility or would he stay at home? And my mom was adamant he was going to stay at home. And she was going to do whatever was necessary to make sure that he received the care that he needed through the end of his life at home. And so instead of car parts in the middle of the living room, we had a hospital bed in the middle of the living room for 5 years while my father was kicked in and out of hospice because he didn't really die on schedule, which I can joke about that now because it was just so much a part of his character. He wasn't going to be bound by anybody else's expectations either. And so we had a bed in our living room. Her friends told her she was crazy. Some of her pastors told her this was not a good idea. And she was committed. This is something that she was going to do because it didn't really matter what everybody else said. This is what she knew in her heart was the right thing. And I think the Volkswagen thing had something to do with that. I really do. I really do. So stories, not only do they reveal things about the characters who are in them and about the teller, but they also can shape how folks live out their future. They can shape their understanding of who we are. Stories give us a place to stand. They give us an identity. They help us to lay claim to aspects of ourselves and our life and our knowledge and our skills and our faith. They give us access to this. Not all stories do this in a positive and good way. I need to name that. Some stories are hurtful, they're painful, and they're not the kind of story that we would want to have to live again or repeat again. Nonetheless, they are part of our experience, and they have shaped who we are in really important and significant ways. And so we want to claim that. We want to name that, how it is that these stories shape our identity. Stories also can testify to a truth that we might not want to say directly. They're a way to convey messages that in a way that folks can understand. Think about Nathan telling the parable to King David. After King David has decided that he wants Bathsheba, and he has Bathsheba's husband murdered. And Nathan says to him, this is in 2 Samuel chapter 12, for those of you who want to be able to check it out later. 2 Samuel chapter 12. Nathan comes to David and he says, there were 2 men in a certain city, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. He took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And Nathan says to David, you are the man. Stories speak to us truths that we might not want to hear. They speak truths that we might not want to hear, or we might not be able to hear in another fashion. They can allow us to speak to one another truths that are very painful and difficult. The story of Mom and the Volkswagen engine on the middle of the living room floor, I should add, because I think that's an important one, is one of those family stories that helps my siblings and I know something about who we are, to whom we belong, what it is that shapes our family. It's a formative story for us. It really shapes our understanding as members of this particular family or this in our little community, the community that we would name as our family. It's that way too, of course, with stories of the Bible. You know this. As we remember these stories, they invite us into their world and they reveal something important about God or ourselves or our relationship to God, our relationships to one another. You've seen this. Whenever we recall the Exodus, that God brought the people out of slavery in Egypt, we're claiming something important about just exactly what kind of God this is. This is a God who desires freedom. This is a God who says no to oppression. When we hear the story of the Exodus and we hear about Pharaoh and his hardened heart, we're reminded how easily it is for earthly power to be corrupted. We know that, and we're given glimpses of that in our own hearts too. Earthly power is easily corrupted, and it binds people in ways that God does not desire. We're also saying other things about ourselves, about what it looks like to trust God, what it looks like to react, how people react in adversity, how difficult it is sometimes to trust in the midst of crisis. We tell these stories because they empower us to face new and challenging situations today. Or, one of my favorites, when we think about the story of Peter in Matthew, and the disciples are in the boat, and there's lots of waves and wind, and Peter in Matthew, he's the guy who's always going, "Hey, Jesus, hey, I know the answer, call on me. Hey, he's kind of the head guy of the disciples, right? And so the way Matthew explains this story, we have the big winds and waves, and the disciples are really scared, and Jesus comes walking to them on the waves and the water, and Peter, good old Peter, I'll come to you. And he steps out of the boat in this remarkable move of faith and trust. And what happens? He starts to sink. But what does this story tell us about the God who comes to us in Jesus Christ? He's right there. Right there. The wind is big, the waves are huge, and Christ is standing right there with a hand for Peter. He steps out in faith, and he sinks, but he doesn't drown. I find that to be a remarkable story. And every time we tell that story, I'm guessing there's a place where you connect to it, or where you do. And I don't know where that place is, because it's going to be different for folks. But these stories invite us to enter in and see ourselves in the midst of them. Our churches, church writ large, I don't mean any particular denomination, our churches are in the storytelling business, aren't we? Isn't that what we do? Isn't that what the church has done all along? I mean, we have 4 Gospels. 4 Gospels. And have you noticed how, even though they're a great deal alike, how different they are? Different. Sometime, just for fun, read the first public act that Jesus does in each one of the Gospels and compare them. In Mark, since we're in the year of Mark now, in Mark, the first public act that Jesus does, do you recall what it is? After he's been baptized, after he calls disciples, he goes to a synagogue, and there's a guy there, and he has an unclean spirit. Remember? And Jesus casts out the unclean spirit. And for those of you who are at my workshop later, we're going to talk about that episode a little bit. But the first episode in the Gospel of Mark is an exorcism. It's Jesus demonstrating his power over whatever it is that binds us. Power over evil, power over the powers. It's a manifestation of God's power in the act of Jesus. What about in Matthew? The first public thing that Jesus does in Matthew after he's been baptized and after he calls his disciples, he goes to a mountain. And he stands at the mountain and he speaks. Sermon on the Mount. First public thing that Jesus does in the Gospel of Matthew. Sermon on the Mount. What about Luke? In Luke, Jesus is back in the synagogue again, and this time he opens a scroll and he reads from the prophet Isaiah, and he testifies that these words have been fulfilled in their healing, that the good news is brought to the poor, the lame, the blind, right? So we have Jesus in Luke, we have him connected to this prophecy and anointing by God, anointing with the Holy Spirit, and then that drives the rest of Luke's gospel. What about John? First public thing that happens in the Gospel of John. Water into wine. It's a party. It's a party. It's an enormous celebration of the abundance of God. And Jesus makes that possible. Every one of those gospel writers selected an episode, a story, a narrative account of something that Jesus did and used that as a way to set up the rest of their narrative. And each one of them is different, as much as they are the same, right? They tell the same story, but they tell it in a slightly different key, with a different emphasis, probably for different communities who needed to hear the word in those words. The church is in the storytelling business. We have the four Gospels. We have Paul's letters, which most of us don't usually think of as narrative, but Paul frequently uses his own story, what he left behind in order to be what he is now, right? All of that he just considers dung for the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus. He tells the story of Christ, not in the same narrative way that the Gospels do, but in the hymn to Christ in chapter 2 of Philippians, we have a beautifully laid out narrative of what it is that God is doing in Jesus Christ. And lots of scholars have worked very hard to identify substructures in Paul's own letters, the way that the letters themselves follow the pattern of some of the Old Testament narratives. Story has been important to us from the beginning. And of course, Jesus' very own method of teaching. Parables. According to Mark, he spoke to his disciples in parables, and without a parable, he told them nothing. Without a parable, he told them nothing. I can just imagine those folks in the early days going around, hey, have you met Jesus? Yeah, he's that guy, he's always telling parables. My mom's always taking apart cars, in the middle of the living room floor. Doesn't mean that's the only thing she ever did, but it's characteristic of her. She took apart the car engine in the middle of the living room floor. Jesus was always telling parables. Storytelling is what we have done from the beginning. So for a next short little while, I'm hoping that you would be willing with me to unpack one of Jesus' stories, one of his parables. And whoever is my tech person, how do I get this screen not to be here and to have my screen show? Anybody know? Look, magic. Pretend this is a whiteboard, because I would really rather have a whiteboard with magic markers than that thing, but you wouldn't be able to see it. Anybody here familiar with the parable of the mustard seed? Anybody familiar with the parable of the yeast? Okay, good. Lots of hands. Okay. Now I'm going to do the thing you all are dreading. You ready? I'm going to invite folks to talk or listen to someone nearby, and for one person in your group to be bold enough to tell the parable of the yeast. I'm going to give you about a minute to do that because it's a really short parable, right? And then I'm going to ask you some questions about what you told and what you heard. Now, I know this is stepping out of the boat in some pretty significant ways for folks, but you can do this. You can do this. The parable of the yeast. Just talk to someone. Just talk. Talk amongst yourselves, and we'll take a minute, and then I'm going to ask you a couple questions. Ding, 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 ding. Okay. Hey, you all did pretty good on that. That was great. Great talking. Okay, so here's the question. I'm going to tell you the parable of the yeast, Matthew's version of the parable of the yeast. It also appears in Luke, and it's virtually identical in Luke. And what I want you to listen for is what you added and what you left out. Okay? What you added and what you left out. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. All right? Did everybody get the kingdom of heaven? Anybody leave out the kingdom of heaven or say something else? Okay, brave souls willing to admit. Okay. You might have said the kingdom of God. That counts too because that's how Luke does it, and I didn't dictate which gospel you were trying to quote, right? But some of us got kingdom of heaven, some of us left it out. Okay, what about yeast? Everybody remembered yeast, or leaven, right? You got that one. Okay, so I want to put it on the board, but I'm going to put it in brackets to indicate that we actually remembered yeast. All of us remembered yeast. Kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took. Did anybody say somebody? It's, yeast that somebody took and mixed it. Everyone got that it was a woman? I see some heads shaking. They're not willing to raise their hands, but they shook their heads. Kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in. Mixed in. Did anybody say anything else? What did you say, Alicia? Hid. We're going to come back to that.
That's what the Greek said.
Yep, and we're going to come back to that. You're right. That's exactly right. So everybody got mixed in. Whoops. How much flour did you use? A huge amount. 3 measures. A lot. 3 cups. No numbers, just some. A bunch, a pile, a 5-pound bag. Okay, so we got the flour, but how much flour? Well, actually, I should ask, did anyone forget the flour? It's hard to make bread without flour. Okay, and until when? Until all of it was leavened. Anybody say something else? Till it rose.
I said mixed thoroughly.
Mixed thoroughly. Okay, so all of it was leavened, and some people had a few other things to say, or they left it out. Okay, so if we were called upon, we're the followers of Jesus, and we heard him tell this parable, and someone says, hey, so what did Jesus say today? And in our collective gathering, if we collectively omitted, okay, so let's just omit the things that collectively we omitted. Are you with me? Here's how we might say this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like, no, that's the wrong way. The is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with, I'm doing this backwards, aren't I? The brackets are the things we remembered. The is like yeast that a and with a flour until our collective omissions leave out kind of a lot. But if we put all of our collective retellings of this story together, we end up with all of them together. We end up with the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Right? So, what does that mean? Kingdom of heaven's like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour till all of it was leavened. You're all thinking something, but you're not saying it.
We talked about how there's different kinds of yeast, and some of it's rapid rise because we're impatient.
Yeah, rapid rise yeast or slow rise yeast because we're impatient. Well, let's look at some of these details really quickly. Kingdom of heaven, in the Greek, this actually says the kingdom of the heavens. In fact, pretty much everywhere the Gospel of Matthew is translated as kingdom of heaven, it actually says kingdom of the heavens. The heavens. And that's distinct from heaven and earth. Heaven and earth are part of the created order of things. God created heaven and earth. The heavens refers to the reign or the way of God. It's God's stuff, right? In Luke, it's the phrase is the kingdom of God. And probably a better term instead of kingdom would be the reign of God, because it's not a place. It's not a place you go, although we do use that language too, but really what Jesus is talking about here is not so much a place as it is a quality of reign or rule. It's God's way. God's way is like yeast. In the first century, they didn't have packets. Or, they couldn't buy it in bulk and sprinkle 2 teaspoons in the bottom of the bread machine, right? Yeast in the first century is, like my Amish neighbors say, friendship bread. It's sourdough. You mix up a little water and a little flour, and you put it aside somewhere in a warm place. And over time, all the little things that are flying around in the air, the little bacterial, yeasty stuff that's flying around, some of it lands in your bowl of flour and water until it starts to bubble. And if you're lucky, most of what lands in there is good yeast, and it helps the bread turn out to be this nice sourdough starter. If you're not lucky, it turns purple and slimy and really icky. Any of you ever made sourdough? It's really nasty when it doesn't work. But if you get a nice bunch of sourdough, once somebody gets it, you can share it with folks, because the way you use sourdough is you take a lump of it, take a handful, a fistful of sourdough, and you put it into your new bread that you're making, and you use that for yeast. So really, if we were going to tell this parable today so that we could capture it, we might want to say something like, the way of God is like a lump of sourdough that a woman took. And we're lifting her up as a woman because isn't it cool that Jesus tells parables about women and men? We just take note of that. He told the parable about the person who sows the mustard in the garden, that's a man, and we have this parable about a woman making bread. So the way of God is like a lump of sourdough that a woman took and mixed in. If you read the NRSV version, I hereby give you permission to cross out those words, mixed in, and instead write hid. She hid it because the Greek for this, and whoops, I forgot. And crypto is the Greek verb. You can even tell what that is in English characters, right? To encrypt something, to hide, to make it secret. All right? She hid this lump of sourdough in 3 measures of flour. 3 measures is important. 3 measures, the measurement that's used in this, is about 50 or 60 pounds of flour. So 10 or 12 of those little 5-pound sacks like you go to the grocery store and they're on sale this week for 99 cents because it's holidays coming, right? So 50 or 60 pounds of flour. Now imagine 10 5-pound bags of flour all in a bowl. Actually, imagine the bowl. It would have to be really, 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 really big. Okay, so you're in the first century and you're hearing this parable and you're hearing the way of God is like a lump of sourdough that a woman took and hid in this impossibly ginormous bowl of flour until the whole thing is leavened. This is not just an image for something little turning big. I mean, it is that, but that's not all it is. She hid this lump of sourdough. She hid it. Nobody knows for sure what's going to happen. They don't know, is this going to turn out to be leavened bread or unleavened bread? It's going to take time before anybody can see the results. She hid a lump of sourdough in 50 or 60 pounds of flour, way more than any one person could ever possibly be able to mix or knead by herself. 50 or 60 pounds of flour till the whole thing was leavened. And that's what the way of God is like. A lump of sourdough hidden in 50 or 60 pounds of flour. Now we should say a little bit more about that lump of sourdough. Yeast is not uncommonly found in the Bible. That is, we find yeast on occasion in the Bible. And there's some important uses of this word throughout the Old and New Testament. And the really remarkable thing is every time that the word yeast or leaven appears in the Bible, every time it's associated with something contaminating. Something contaminating. Let me give you a couple of quick references. Leviticus 2, chapter 11. No grain offering that you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you must not turn any leaven or honey into smoke as an offering by fire to the Lord. No leaven in those special things that you bring. Okay, the command from Leviticus. From Exodus 12:15, this is the institution of Passover You remember the story of Passover, what happens? People are leaving behind their kneading bowls and their yeasted bread. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats unleavened bread from the first day through the 7th day shall be cut off from Israel. Then we hear Paul in 1 Corinthians 5. 1 Corinthians 5, starting at verse 6. Your boasting is not a good thing. Do you not know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Clean out the old yeast, so that you may be a new batch, as you really are unleavened. For our Paschal Lamb, Christ, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the festival, not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Or Jesus, who shortly after telling this parable says to his disciples, let me find this, Matthew, this is in Matthew 16. Jesus tells the parable, a bunch of other stuff happens. He feeds the multitudes with bread and fish, right? And then in chapter 16, he says to the disciples, their disciples have gotten in a boat, they've gone over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and they forgot to bring any bread. And Jesus says to them, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they're all confused and say, oh, it's because we didn't bring any bread, because apparently they forgot that doesn't really seem to be a problem. He just fed 5,000 people, right? But they have this little discussion, and Jesus says, why are you talking about bread? He goes on and reminds them of what he had done among them, and then he says, then they understood that he had not told them to beware of the yeast of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So Jesus used yeast as a way to convey something important about what they needed to watch out for. Look out for this. Look out for the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Just look out. Yeast as a contaminant. So think about that in the parable for a minute. The way of God is like a contaminating lump of sourdough that a woman took and hid in 50 or 60 pounds of flour until the whole thing was leavened. And that's what the way of God is like. Right about now, I'm ready to sit with the disciples and go, what? Could you maybe tell us a little more about that? A contaminating lump of sourdough. That's the way of God. Any of you have ever encountered mold in your houses? Mold, we pay extra for our insurance policies to cover mold removal, right? Mold is a really bad thing, contamination when it appears in our house. Can't have penicillin without mold. Can't have penicillin without mold. Pearls. How is a pearl formed? A contaminating piece of grit gets into that critter, that oyster body. And what does the oyster do? It covers up the grit, keeps it from being an irritant, makes it a beautiful, incredible pearl. It takes a contaminant to make a pearl. The way of God is like a contaminating lump of sourdough that a woman took and hid in 50 or 60 pounds of flour until the whole thing was leavened. Now, if you're still scratching your heads, that's because this is what stories do to us. They bring us in a little bit, we kind of think we're getting what they're saying, and then all of a sudden we hit some piece that maybe is a surprise, not what we expected. lay something out in a way we hadn't thought of before. And now we're going to have to be thinking about that again and again and again and again. It's just going to bug us like a little contaminating lump of sourdough. It's going to bug us to figure out, what is Jesus teaching us about the ways of God? You all will have answers to that, and those answers will depend in part on the places you serve, the people you encounter, the challenges they face. The answers will be slightly different, I suspect, for how that parable does its work of conveying the truth about the God in Christ that we serve. And it's going to take all of those encounters and stories together, just like it took all of us to retell the parable. It's going to take those for us together to embody the gospel news that we have for the world. It's going to take all of those stories. But I hope this contaminating lump of sourdough goes home with you and sits on the counter and bubbles and oozes, and every once in a while you stir it around a little bit and see what it's doing, and maybe take a piece of it and try planting it over here somewhere and watch and see what happens. Or maybe borrow a lump from somebody else's sourdough and put it into a setting or a place that's way bigger than anything you could imagine possibly being able to solve or encounter or resolve or fix or whatever. Just plant that sourdough. Because one of the things that this parable says to us, if the way of God is like a lump of sourdough hidden in 50 or 60 pounds of flour, what happens to that sourdough, whether it rises into dough or not, that's not ours to control. There's a way when you're baking bread. Any bread bakers out there? You know, when you're baking bread, you can do lots of work. You can knead, you can set the temperature just right, you can mix in just the amount of water that's just right. But there's a time where you kind of have to step back and trust the process. See what's going to happen. See what's going to happen. Jesus tells us the way of God, the kingdom of heaven, will be revealed. That's why he came. Why he came. To reveal the ways of God, to reveal the kingdom of heaven. Like a lump of sourdough hidden in 50 or 60 pounds of flour. There are a lot of ways for us to serve God. There are a lot of stories for us to tell about the ways of God. There's a whole big wide world out there that is trying to convince us that there are other stories more important than this one. Born to shop. That's kind of a short little story. You see it on bumper stickers everywhere. Born to shop. Well, it's kind of cute and funny, but you know what? We're not born to shop. Really? Be afraid. Be very, very afraid. I kind of think that's the dominating narrative in the world that we live in, because there are very real places of fear, real ones that need to be called out and named. But we cannot let the fear keep us from telling the stories together, from sharing with each other about our experiences in the face of that fear. But that's a narrative that the world is telling us. Be afraid. Why is it that the scriptures have so many commands in them, both Old and New Testament, that say, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. The false narratives that tell us that some people are worth less than others. That's not the way of God. That is not the way of God. And we have the stories to tell. We have the story to tell. And lest you ever doubt your capacity to tell that story, I want to share one last short, very brief illustration with you as a way of closing up this morning. My husband and I do not have children. There are a lot of children in our lives. Some of them are related to us by blood, and some of them are related to us by love. who call us aunt and uncle, or aunt and uncle. In my family, we say aunt, just so you know. Okay? About 5 years ago or so, two of those children, the grandmother of two of those children bought them one of those little toy nativity sets with a little wooden stable, and there's a Mary and a Joseph and a baby and a few wise men and a camel and a sheep and a donkey, the little collection of stuff. And their parents said to me, it's your job to teach them about that stuff. And I said, oh, okay. So one day I was visiting with these children, and they came to me and they said, Aunt Audrey, tell us the story that goes with these people. And I said, oh, okay. And it was right before Christmas, so they had the thing out, and they have it all set up. So we set up the little nativity, the little stable thing. We put it on the coffee table, and we put Mary and Joseph in there. And baby Jesus, for now, is stuck in the pocket of one of the kids because they're looking for stuff. So Mary and Joseph are in the stable. We put the shepherd and the sheep off on the sofa, a little ways away. And the wise men, I banished them clear over to the other side of the room on top of the piano because it wasn't time for them yet. So they were off on one side, and I proceeded to narrate for them basically the Gospel of Luke, the birth narrative from the Gospel of Luke. I said, Mary and Joseph, they got pregnant, and an angel said, you're going to have a baby. And this was both horrifying and incredible news. And so they traveled to this place, and they try to find a place to stay for Mary to have the baby, and she can't. There is no place, and so they end up back behind the inn, and they give birth to the baby Jesus, and they lay him in the manger. And the angels sang, and the shepherds came, and they rejoiced when they saw the baby. They were so happy about the news of this baby, and everybody's singing and having a grand old time. It was wonderful, and that's what happened on the first Christmas. And one of the kids said, well, then what happened? I said, oh, well, the baby, he grew up and became a grown-up. And when he was a grown-up, he taught people lots of things about God and how much God loves them and God loves the world. And it was just remarkable. And Francis says, well, then what happened? And I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is my chance. I'm a New Testament scholar. Am I going to teach them Luke's version? Or Matthew's version? Or are we going to mix it? What are we going to do? And I decided, to heck with New Testament scholars. I just told them a story. So now we have Jesus grown up, and he's going around teaching. And I said, well, let's pretend that the shepherd is a guy, and Mary's going to be one of Jesus' disciples along with somebody else. And Jesus will have, let's have one of those wise men play Jesus. So we rearranged the characters so that they could play different parts in the story. I said, well, one time Jesus was outside of a house, and these guys had a friend who was sick, and so they wanted him to see Jesus so badly that they tore open the roof of the house, and they lowered their friend down, and Jesus healed him. And it was wonderful. And then Jesus went, and he stood beside the sea, and he taught his followers all kinds of great stuff. And it was just fabulous, because they learned about God and how much God loves them. And Georgie says, then what happened? So I told a few more stories. I shared a parable or two with them. I think I probably told them the parable of the Good Samaritan, because that's a nice story they could kind of connect into. We get to Holy Week. And of course, there's the question, well, then what happened? So, Jesus went into Jerusalem, and there's these big, huge stones there where the temple was, and he had a few things to say about the stones. I said, by the way, you guys, I've been to Jerusalem, and I have seen those stones. And my Georgie says, you've seen them? You mean they're real? I said, yeah, I've been there. He goes, oh. But now we're in Holy Week, and I'm trying to explain to two children who have never been to church what happens in those terrifying events of that week. And so I try to say it pretty quickly. Well, there were some people who didn't like what Jesus was saying, and it was kind of threatening to the powers that be, and so They wanted to kill him, and so they crucified him. What's crucifixion? What's crucify? What's crucify? I said, well, that's where they kill you by putting you on a cross. What's a cross? So we go out in the backyard, and we find 2 sticks. And I can't tell this without getting emotional. We put these 2 sticks on top of each other, and we take one of their little figurines, and we spread out its arms, and we put it on the sticks. And I say, they held him to the cross with big spikes through his hands and his feet, his legs and his wrists. Georgie, by this time, is behind the couch, and he pokes his little head up, and he says, what happened then? And Frances has now moved her way under my arm, and she's crying, and she says, why did they do that? He didn't do anything wrong. So I say to them, well, after Jesus died, his friends came, they put him inside of a cave in a tomb, and they rolled a stone in front of it so that nobody could get in. And a little while later, some of his friends, the women, went, and they wanted to take care of his body, to show respect to him after he died. And they got there, and the stone wasn't in front of the door. And Georgie pokes his head up from behind the couch, and he says, then what happened? I said, well, they got inside, and there was nobody there because God loved the world so much that God would not let Jesus stay dead. And Georgie jumped up from behind the couch, threw his arms in the air, and he said, you mean he's alive? And Frances is staring at me with her mouth open, and she said, then what happened? I ended the story there, and I said to them, that's what we're going to see. That's what we're going to find out. That's what we're learning every single day that we're alive. Then what happened? What happened next? You have the story to tell. This world needs this gospel. And the gospel has power. It has power to affect the lives even of people who have never, ever heard it before. Those children are now 12. This is a little postscript to the story. Those children are now 12. Not long after that incident, they convinced their parents that they really needed to visit a church. And so they did. And that's a whole nother story that makes for fun conversation, but I'll skip that part. Recently, I published that episode about the Then What Happened story, and I showed it to them, and Georgie said to me, so, you know, the trouble with this, Aunt Audrey, is you make it sound like we don't know God or Jesus. And I said, well, Georgie, when you were 7, you didn't know them. Oh, yeah, he said. And then he said, so basically, you're telling this story about us like, so you're using us. You're using us to tell this story about Jesus. And I said, yeah, I kind of am. I kind of am. And I want you to know, Georgie and Frances, I said this to both of them, I want you to know that you guys, in hearing that story about the baby Jesus who grew up to be the grown-up Jesus and whom God wouldn't let stay dead, you guys are part of telling that story now too, because you let me tell it as I go around speaking to groups. And so From Georgie and Francis, I say to all of you, thank you for being those who share the story. It has the power of the God who comes to us in Jesus Christ. Because God so loves this world that not even the cross can destroy us or Jesus or God. Now's the day. Go tell the story. And thank you for the ways that you tell it and live it every single day. And thanks for talking to each other, too. Thank you.